Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, this is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Gavin Menzies, and he's got 2 or 3 books out right now about ancient history, and he's uncovered some facts that, well, they go against this, the natural history you learn in school. However, he does have the proof to back it up, and this is just stuff that's recently come to light, actually. And his books are 1421 and 1434, and I'm having trouble. I'm going to get him to quote these to you in a minute. I'm having trouble making out the subtitles. But the main book we're going to talk about today is The Lost Empire of Atlantis, in which he thinks he's discovered where it's located at. He thinks he's revealed it, and he's going to tell us where and why. Gavin, how are you doing tonight?
Well, I'm fine. Thank you very much for inviting me to your show, Royce.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on my show, and I got to tell you, I found your book title in Amazon.com when I was searching around over there, and I thought it was very interesting because I have an interest in the lost continent of Atlantis, and I even had a friend that here a year or 2 ago, we did some work studying about the Minoans in Crete and Santorini, and she had theorized the same thing you had about this place, but I think I'll let you go into more detail about it. Why don't you start off by telling us what those book titles were that I couldn't make out the subtitles on?
Right, okay. Well, my first book, which was published in 2002, is called 1421, The Year China Discovered America. And my second book was 1434, The Year China Sparked the Renaissance. Both of those 2 books were about Chinese seafarers who traveled to the West, and they'd made maps of the Americas and Europe, world maps, and they presented these maps to the Pope, and he in turn gave a copy to Christopher Columbus and the King of Portugal. So basically, Columbus discovered America in 1492, but with the aid of Chinese maps of the Americas.
People had been there before.
People had been there before.
So it had been more of a rediscovery.
Yes, absolutely. And this book, which you're kindly interviewing me tonight, is, as you said, The Lost Empire of Atlantis, History's Greatest Mystery Revealed. And the subtitle is The Astonishing True Story of the Rise and Violent End of the Minoans, the forgotten ancient civilization that discovered America and sparked the Atlantis legend.
Okay. Now, before we go into Atlantis, I thought I would mention to you that my last guest was Frank Joseph, who's done a lot of research in ancient America, and he's come to some of the same findings that you've been coming to. According to him, there's been people that's been traveling over to America from the Middle East and Far East for tens of thousands of years. Is that pretty much what you're...
Yes, I would go along with that. In my book, I say the Minoans were not the first. They were the first people who mined copper in the Great Lakes. But before them, 7,000 years before them, there'd been another people, and this is shown up in the DNA. There's a haplogroup called X, which is unique to the Minoans and to the peoples who live around the Great Lakes of North America. And there are 2 huge spikes showing when the invasions took place. One is 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago, and the second one is 7,000 years older than that. So I would agree with him that people have been traveling across the oceans for the best part of 10,000 years.
So there's really history needs to be rewritten to accommodate for the new findings then.
Yes, absolutely. I don't want to decry Christopher Columbus. He was a very, very skillful sailor. He was a wonderful mathematician. He was very brave, and he found out how the winds of the Atlantic worked and the currents. So he produced charts which showed how mariners could get from Spain to the Americas with the wind, and how they could get home again with the wind by going up north. So he played a very, very valuable role, but as he himself accepts, he did not discover America because he had a chart, a map of the Caribbean, which showed him the way there.
Right.
He accepts this because he sailed with the wind from Spain, from Sanlúcar to Barrameda for the Americas in 1492. And he was very brave, the first person to sail with the wind. Now, normally, explorers sailed into the wind so that if they ran out of food or water, they could turn around and sail back home with the wind, and they'd have a chance of getting there. Columbus did exactly the opposite. He sailed out with the wind, which meant that if his water and food ran out, he couldn't get back home. And his sailors realized this. And after he'd been 21 days out in the Atlantic, his sailors realized they were very short on food, and they'd just about finished their water, and they were threatening to mutiny. And Columbus gathered them all on the upper deck, and he put on his best robes and his medal and so on. And he said, "I can assure you that we will be safe, we'll find our way, because I have a map which shows the way there." And he sent this map over to his fellow captain and for him to have a look at as well. So all his sailors and his fellow captains were reassured. On they went, and they found America 2 days later.
Okay. Now, I was listening to your interview with a woman, I can't remember her name, but I found it over at YouTube. And
Right.
At the very beginning of y'all's interview, you went into quite a bit of detail about a museum that you found over there by Crete that had all this here stuff in it about
Yes.
the Minoans and the marble that they used and other things like that.
Yes.
And
yes.
I thought you might share that with us.
Yes, I'd be delighted to, Royce. The island of basically what happened was that these people, the Minoans, founded a trading empire from the Great Lakes of North America across to England and France and Spain and then across the Mediterranean to Egypt and then to India. And they made their money by combining Great Lakes copper and Cornish tin. Cornwall in southwest England has very rich tin. And they made bronze, 85% copper, 12% tin. Makes very good bronze. And they created this empire from about 2500 BC to 1200 BC. Then they were all blown to bits by a massive volcanic eruption on an island of Santorini just to the north of Crete, which blew all their civilization to bits. And a huge tsunami followed this gigantic eruption, and it smashed up all the ships that were in Crete and the harbors in northern Crete and so on. And it was actually a catastrophe. Now, my wife and I wanted to see if we could find any records. And so we went to this island of Santorini, and we found to our astonishment that there's a museum there which has in it wall paintings taken from an admiral's palace in Santorini. Now, about 50 years ago, a group of archaeologists decided they would drill down through all the volcanic muck which this volcanic eruption had caused on the island of Santorini. And they chose the south of the island, and where they drilled down, they came across the capital by pure luck. And not only that, they actually drilled down into the house of an admiral. Now, how do they know it was the house of an admiral? Because around the walls of this admiral's palace, there were pictures of these ships, and they'd been preserved from 1450 BC, which was the date of the eruption, for 3,500 years, and they were in absolutely perfect condition. So you can see on the walls of this palace a fleet of ships returning to harbor in Santorini, and they're very, very accurately drawn. You can see how they sailed, how they were built, how big they were. They were 3 times the size of Columbus's ships, which were built, of course, 3,000 years later. Now, once we'd seen these paintings and we knew what the ships looked like, we searched around to see if we could find any wrecks, or to find if others had found wrecks. And in fact, 3 wrecks of these ships have been found on the eastern Mediterranean. One of the ships is 3,300 years old, another 3,100 years old, and the third 3,600 years old. And the dating, how they knew this, is from the wood, and nobody disputes the dating. Now, the interesting thing about these wrecks was that they were at the bottom of the sea, off the coast of Turkey, about 200 miles from where we were in Santorini, and they had been carrying copper, and the copper had reacted with the seawater, and it had killed off bugs which normally bore through ship's wood, which is sitting on the bottom. So there were large chunks of hull that were perfectly okay, and because of that, the sea currents didn't get into the bottom of the ship, into the hold of the ship. So the original cargo that they were carrying was still there in the ships when they sank, and it was still there when the ships were brought to the surface about 40 years ago. Now, the hold, the contents of the cargo in the hold came from 6 different continents. They came from, for example, from India, they had elephant tusks. From Africa, they had hippopotamus teeth. From Mesopotamia, they had gold. From Egypt, they had blue beads, glass beads, and so on. And from the Baltic, Northern Europe, they had amber. So we were really astonished by this. We found it absolutely extraordinary that ships 3,500 years ago could trade across a large part of the world. So what we decided to do was to go and investigate all the places from whence these goods came to see if there was corroborative evidence that the Minoans had actually been there. So, for example, we started with amber. We went to the Baltic to see where the amber came from, and we found there was very clear evidence that Minoans had been there because they basically had 2 huge urns which came from the Minoan ship, which they could tell by carbon dating, by the style of the urns. They'd been using these urns for storing food. They were still there. They were found underneath peat, and they could sort out the date of these by the date of the peat there. And we followed that process with all of the goods found in the wrecks. We went all over the world. We spent a lot of time and effort, and we found corroborative evidence everywhere, and that's the basis of my book.
Well, that's very interesting, actually, and the fact that you went traveling to so many different locations to, do your investigation, it shows that it wasn't a cheap one to do. In other words, you had to put a lot of time, a lot of money, and sweat into this here to get all the information that went into the book. In other words,
yes, it was. It's very time-consuming, Royce, and very expensive. And you run your own show, so you know how costs can mount up. And we employed quite a few researchers and so on. And really, the fact that all of this came out as being Atlantis was a complete accident. I hadn't intended to write a book about Atlantis at all. I was just out of curiosity, finding out who these Minoan people were. And when I found out that they had a civilization which stretched from North America, the Great Lakes, to England, Scotland, the Atlantic Islands, northwest France, southwest Spain, across the Mediterranean to Egypt and so on. And when I found that this whole civilization had been destroyed by one day and one night by a huge volcanic eruption and a vast tsunami, I suddenly realized what I described in my book was what Plato described in his book called Critias. So it was really exactly the same story, but he called them Atlantis peoples, and I call them, and we all call them today, Minoans.
Okay, now that was one of the things that you had mentioned on that other interview I'd listened to, was the fact that most people make the mistake of thinking that just because Atlantis has a similar name to the Atlantic Ocean, that's what it was named by, and in all actuality, it was actually named after Poseidon's son, Atlas.
Yes, that's quite true. And it's also true that there have been slight, I won't say mistakes, but the translation of the book by Plato has been slightly refined in recent years. The old translation people used to say Plato described the empire of Atlantis being based in the Atlantic. But what modern translators have found is what he actually said was that the Atlantis people came out of the Mediterranean, out of the Atlantic, which is exactly what happened. They decided that they got greedy, basically. They returned from the Americas with huge quantities of copper, which they made into bronze. They got incredibly rich. And they decided to invade Greece, as Plato describes it, and the gods, he says, got very angry. What in effect happened was this volcano blew up. So the description of the Americas is very, very important, and that was of great assistance to me when I wrote the book and I got his refined translation.
Right. There's another writing I think that was also very handy to you when you got a hold of the writer who translated it. And
yes.
The interesting thing is that this particular writing I'm talking about was something 2 or 3 years ago I'd been discussing with my friend online, that the oldest known writing at the time for the Minoans was a linear B, I believe.
Yes.
But they did have a linear A that was further back that
yes.
they had not been able to translate yet, but you found somebody who could translate it, haven't you?
Well, yes, Royce, that's quite correct, but I should say that I didn't go out and find this professor. He, by an amazing freak, he found me. What happened was that I sold the literary rights of my book, The Lost Empire of Atlantis, to Orion back in 2010, and they issued a press release which basically outlined what I'd said in the book. And the Greek government picked up this press release, and they asked me to appear on television, which of course I was delighted to do. Now, on this program with me, there was a Greek professor called Minas Sakritsis. I'd never met him before the program. I never heard of him. He'd never heard of me. He didn't know there was anything in my book. And after the program, when I'd outlined where the Minoans went, he came up to me and said we should meet, which we did. And he said, "It's this most extraordinary thing that I've spent 20 years researching Minoan Linear A, the undeciphered language. And I found that the Minoans traveled all over the world as traders, exactly where you said in your book." Now, he then sent me an email which listed these places, so 9 places across the world, including Greenland and the Atlantic and so on. He'd found this Linear A writing, so he could say for sure that they'd traveled there. And he'd spent 20 years decoding, decrypting Linear A, Linear B, Crypto-Minoan, Cypro-Minoan, and Ancient Greek. And he'd mastered all these languages and worked out computer programs to decipher the Linear A language. And he has now done it. And we're going to write a joint book about what he's found, which is basically that these Minoan people were incredibly sophisticated. They had 4-story houses. They had running hot and cold water. They had flushing toilets. The women were really beautifully dressed. They had long dresses with strapless backs, strapless bras. They had perfume, lipstick, rouge, eye kohl, and so on. And they lived very well. They had wine and beer and lots of meat. And they were just very, very advanced people. But they were also really nice people. They didn't, until the violent end, they didn't try and conquer anyone. So their cities were open. They didn't have walls around them. And they were very keen on having fair taxation system, for example. So 3,500 years ago, they had a taxation system which was based on the principles of from those according to their ability to pay tax to those according to their need who would receive subsidies. So they had this fair and just taxation system. They were very, very skilled metal workers. They could make bronze implements of all sorts, swords, for example, bronze swords which are very sharp. They could use those to cut wood and metal. They could build ships of planks, which was a huge advantage over what had come before them, which was ships made out of carved-out logs, which were terribly heavy and clumsy and so on. And the Minoans came along with these saws. They carved planks. They could make much lighter and stronger ships, which could sail in all weathers. They could also, of course, make bronze defensive weapons and defensive armor. So their soldiers had good armor and good weapons, and they could use implements for farming. They had spades, shovels, hoes, saws, and so on. And for kitchenware, they had more or less standardized kitchen equipment of pots and pans and saucepans and so on. And above all, they had lots of beautiful jewelry made out of bronze and copper and precious stones.
Wow. Sounds a lot like America.
It's amazing, really, what people were like all those years ago. I thought before I started off writing this book, that they were savages who clubbed animals for meat and ran around unwashed for weeks on end and so on, but quite the opposite.
Well, yeah, also, I was just thinking about the fact if there was a Linear B language and an older one, Linear A,
yes.
Could it be that the Linear A come from an older civilization that might have been even more advanced than the Linear B in a different generation that could have been known as the Atlanteans on the Linear A, but the Linear B was the Minoans, say, coming in and taking over where they used to be?
Well, I think you're right, funny enough. I mean, I haven't included this in my book because I didn't have any proof. But there are two big spikes, as I said, in the DNA. So there was, just going back for a moment to the DNA, haplogroup X2 is found from only in places where the Minoans came from, that's Anatolia, where they lived and were based, that's Crete and Santorini and the islands in the central Mediterranean, where they sailed to, that's North America, and nowhere else. So you can see this DNA in the Ojibwa people who live around the Great Lakes of North America, from whence the copper was mined. And you can see it in Crete and Santorini, and also in the east, in Anatolia, as I said. Now, this meant that there was another seagoing people who preceded the Minoans going to America 9,000 years before them. And there have been several books published by well-known professors that said there was a world civilization in about 9 to 11,000 BC, and it's evidenced by maps. And the leading exponent of these theories is a man called Professor Charles Hapgood. And he wrote a map saying that, he wrote a book claiming that the peoples who created this empire 9,000 to 11,000 years ago made maps which had different characteristics and shorelines to maps of today. For example, the Arctic, which appeared on these maps, is precisely how the Arctic was 11,000 years ago. Since then, the ice caps have changed position. So he argued that there must have been, because of this map, which is called the Piri Race map, there must have been this advanced civilization. And everyone, of course, hooted with laughter and said it's absolutely ridiculous, including, I'm afraid to say, myself. 7 years ago, I thought it was an absurd proposition, but now, having found out what I have, I've really changed my mind, and I think he's just a very clever man. He had bad luck, nobody took him seriously.
That's really interesting, and, it would explain a whole lot of things if there were two peoples in two different settings there at two different times. And even Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, even though he's not scientific, he dated back the Atlanteans to 11,000 BC.
Yes. Well, I think what we've got now, Royce, is, I think, so many new research tools that people are beginning to think, well, is the history we've been taught really true? I mean, how can Columbus be said to have discovered America if he had a copy of a Chinese map with him? And not only that, he had a contract in his pocket with the King of Spain that he was going to be Viceroy of the Americas on behalf of the Spanish crown. So if you're going to be a viceroy of a place, when you get there, it must be known. And similarly, if you get there with a map, you can't have discovered where you're going to. So, and same with Magellan. I mean, he had a map showing him his route. He accepts he had a map. So how can it be said it was a map of the world? He was the first to circumnavigate the world. Of course he wasn't. And it goes just about every sort of aspect you can think of. For example, the Bering Straits theory of people populated America by crossing the Bering Straits.
The land bridge?
Sorry?
You mean the land bridge?
Yes, the Bering Straits Bridge, yes, exactly. I mean, if that was true, then the DNA of people should be the same on both sides of the Bering Straits. And DNA should gradually mutate after they cross the Bering Straits into North America. And it should mutate as they travel southwards to warmer climes. Well, it doesn't. The DNA says exactly the opposite, that people came in fits and starts over a long period by sea. So all of this will be reassessed and re-examined, I think. And I think it's fair to say the history we've been taught is really fantasy, fairy stories.
I think it was based largely upon assumptions.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what happens here, and this could just be me, is if you had a more advanced civilization that maybe got destroyed in a cataclysm, and then you got somebody restarting, well, the people restarting might have trouble believing that there was once a higher technology, so they go by what they think seems the most logical rather than what actually is. Yes.
Well, I entirely agree. I think that, how would I put it? Charles Darwin really, he's almost sort of sacrosanct. It's almost heresy to criticize in any way what his theories. But he basically said that human beings evolved from apes and they gradually refined their way of life and so on, one civilization after the other. It's a sort of sequence of continuous improvement. And I think that's not correct at all, in that there have been, as you say, the most terrible setbacks. I mean, 2,500 years ago, I think, for the reasons I've set out in my book, that the Minoans could calculate latitude and longitude. Now, that was lost in the Dark Ages. And basically, the way the solar system works, which I think that the Minoans and the so-called Atlanteans knew, was not really sorted out in Europe until Copernicus and Galileo 3,000 years later. So there was a dark age of about 3,000 years in celestial navigation and mathematics. And similarly, in all sorts of other ways. I mean, in 2000 BC, people had electric batteries. And we say that this was discovered or invented in 1899, I think it was, whereas people had them 4,000 years earlier. And similarly with navigating ships, you know, the ships that the Minoans sailed in were far in advance of Christopher Columbus's little ship. And Columbus was 3,500 years later.
Okay. Now, also, when I was listening to you at the other radio show, the one I can't remember the name of, I wish I'd, bookmarked the page where I could open it up and mention it, but at any rate, you can find it on YouTube by Googling your name into the YouTube, not Googling, but putting your name in the YouTube search engine.
It's Rain Making Time, I think. The one lady who's interviewed me was Kim Greenhouse from
yeah, that sounds like it. That sounds like the one, yeah. But what I was going to say, you were telling her about a lot of the things that was in Plato's Timaeus Criterius that the Minoans already had and matched, and how they worked out almost perfectly.
Yes. Well, this is completely true. What Plato said was that the Atlantis Empire was based on islands, plural. Well, the Minoans' empire was based on Santorini and Crete, so that works. Plato said that the smaller of the islands was 12 miles across. Santorini is 12 miles across. The bigger of the two islands was rectangular, many times the size of the smaller island, that's what Crete is in relation to Santorini, and that the bigger islands produced fruit and vegetables of all sorts and perfume, and that's exactly what happens in Crete. And the people who lived in these islands, the Atlanteans, were metalworking culture, which is correct, the Minoans were, and the only metalworking culture that existed on islands, which Plato was describing thousands of years ago, were the Minoans. There was nobody else could be. He describes the terrible end of this civilization came in one day and one night, and that's exactly what happened with Santorini and Crete. He describes their houses, 4 and 5 story houses, which is what the Minoans had. He describes them as being a literate people. In other words, they had writing, and the only people who were living on islands who were literate at the time Plato was describing were the Minoans. They had inscribed stone and copper tablets for writing, and there's plenty of those left. You can go and see it. So really, he describes everything almost exactly, got, in my view, everything absolutely dead right, apart from the size of Crete, which I think has been mistranslated because he describes it exactly twice what it should be. Other than that, everything, as I found, to my amazement, that he describes is true.
And go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't know you weren't through it. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear that.
Oh, no, I said I accidentally spoke over you. You'd paused for a second. I thought you were through. I apologize for that.
So really, everything that Plato describes as being the empire of Atlantis was, in fact, the empire of the Minoans. And even when he describes things, really quite detailed things, like in Santorini, he describes the island having a central harbor, which it did have. He describes the sea being covered with tephra when the volcanic eruption happened, which indeed it did have. And he describes colored bricks that we use to build houses, which you can see today if you go to Santorini. So if you go to Santorini and you take a copy of my book and a copy of Plato's Critias, which I include great chunks of in my book, you can see it for yourself. That's where Atlantis was.
Okay. Now, I wanted to remind everybody out there listening, because not everybody's at my website. Some are at Shoutcast, some are at iTunes or whatever, that the call-in number is 832-632-7904 if you'd like to call in and ask Gavin a question. And you can also go to his website, and he's got articles there and bio there that you can get a little bit more introduced to him and what all his work is all about, not only on this, but on the other 2 books he mentioned at www.gavinmenzies.net. And I've pasted that into the chat room already, and I'll paste it again since I see chatters have scrolled past that point, so make sure it's in there for newcomers. Now, I noticed that one of the things I had to ask about or wonder about was, we know that Atlantis was named after Poseidon's son, Atlas, but what was the Atlantic Ocean named after? Was it the same thing as well?
I think so, yes. I think it was. Yep.
And so that could be how people made the same misunderstanding about what they called it, was because of the fact that it was a territory that belonged to Atlas, maybe.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay, now, was you able to determine if Santorini or Crete over there, either one, was set up with the concentric rings of water around the actual landmass, like the Plato described?
Well, yes, Santorini is... What happened, Royce, was that the island was formed in its present shape about 20,000 years ago, and at its center was a mountain which was in fact a volcano. Now, Plato's first description is an island 12 miles across, which is what Santorini is, circular, which Santorini was, with a low mountain in the center, which was what Santorini was before the first mega explosion. There was then a huge mega explosion about 15,000 years ago, long before the Minoans. And that explosion blew a large chunk of this island of Santorini, the middle of it, into the stratosphere and caused havoc worldwide. That's before the Minoans. And Plato describes that happening by describing a canal which the gods, he said, drove through the island to the sea, and also it created semicircles of water. All that all happened. Then Plato describes the final catastrophe, which was in 1450 BC, when the whole center of the island was blown into the air, leaving a sort of croissant-like shape left for the rest of the island. And he describes all the tephra floating on the surface of the sea, which looked like mud, and he describes the circular bands of water around the central islands, which you can see today. There are two islands in the middle of this interior of Santorini, two called Kameni Islands. So they're there today. So again, what Plato described is actually there. You can take a boat and go and examine them, and you can also bathe in the hot springs, which Plato describes. They're still there, and the inhabitants of Santorini and tourists use them for frolicking and washing and so on.
So what do you suppose has caused it to be so hard for people to find what's right out in open sight?
Well, because of America. See, what Plato described was a continent, the other side of the Atlantic, which the Minoan citizens, well, that's clearly America. Now, what hasn't happened until my book, I think, it's rather conceited to say so, but people haven't put two and two together and said, well, did the Minoans get to America? Well, to be fair to everyone, that didn't become apparent until these three ships, which I described, were found on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And they had copper in their holds, as I explained. Now, the copper they had in their holds has been analyzed. There were about 350 different ingots, and they had very different types of copper. Some ingots were had lots of sulfur and so on, and others didn't. Now, there are about 12 ingots there which have copper of amazing purity, 99.9% pure copper. No arsenic, no bismuth, no this, that, and the other. No muck in with the copper. It's just pure, pure, pure. Now, the only place in the world that has copper of that purity is copper from the Great Lakes, which is 99.9% pure. And my real breakthrough came when I got my hands on what I think is every metallurgical report written about Great Lakes copper. I got 13 of them, and they are unanimous that Great Lakes copper was 99.9% pure. So in other words, you can match that up with the copper found in these ships, which are 1,600 years old, which are 3,600 years old, which are sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. So that was the real clincher, and I could say, well, there was an island known to the Minoans, the other side of the Atlantic, as described by Plato. As described by Plato, the continent was as big as Libya and Egypt combined, which America is. There are islands that they could stop off on the way to Americas, which there are, the Azores, Cape Verde Islands, Canaries, and so on. And there are islands on the way back. So that was, I could show that what Plato was describing is actually there, and they actually did it. And so that's what really changed my mind. Instead of writing a book about solely the Minoan Empire, I realized that it solved the riddle that Plato had written about. And so Plato's incredibly accurate.
Now, have there been any further digs going on at Santorini or Crete that, say, might turn up a civilization under the present civilization?
I don't know. That's a very interesting thought. Funny enough, nobody's suggested that.
Well, I know it's commonplace in the Middle East to build right on top of the old place, in other words.
Yes.
And I was thinking perhaps this also transpired there.
Yes, well, you know, I never thought about it. Hopefully someone's going to go and start digging that.
Yeah, I'd be interested in finding out what they find when they did it, because there's been a lot of legends that come out of Atlantis about the Quinator, the Labyrinth, and
yes,
you know, things of this nature. And there are some people that even speculate that some of the stories about the Fisher Kings of Morovia having ties back to Atlantis, and they use this mythology and symbology of the Quinator going after Europa, and you have to wonder now if there's some kind of connection in there.
Well, you're right, Royce. You know, and thank you for reading the book so carefully. The Minotaur was a bull which was kept underneath the palace of King Minos, and it was said to be a horrible beast, half Minotaur was half bull, half man. But the bull side of it is absolutely correct. Underneath the palace in Santorini and in Crete, there are labyrinths in which the bulls were kept. And you can see in the frescoes on Santorini of the ships returning to harbour from an unknown far distant destination. You can see people leading bulls down to put them in the ships. And wherever the Minoans travelled, from India through the Middle East to southwest Spain, northwest France, everywhere they travelled, they took their bulls with them, their cattle, and the legends today, of course, have been translated into bullfighting. So, for example, if you look at the sketches in the Prado Museum in Madrid, you can see Goya has drawn people leaping over the bulls with a long stick, so leaping onto the front of the bull and somersaulting off the back. And that is exactly what you can see the Minoans did, because it appears on their carvings. The carvings on stone and on bronze and copper are just that. So you can see the bulls, the legend of the Minotaur bulls was actually correct. The bull was a bull, not half bull, half man, but other than that, everything fits pretty well.
Okay. Now, during your investigation or your research, was you able to ascertain anything about the religious practices of the Minoans?
Yes, there's a lot of paintings, and there's a lot of what they call seals. Seals is a way of safeguarding goods. So you tie up your bag of copper or whatever, and then where the knot is, you plonk some sealing wax, and then you imprint on top of the sealing wax with your personal seal. So it stops stuff being stolen. Now, many of these seals, there were 6,000 seals found in the Palace of Phaistos alone, and a hell of a lot of these have pictures of, well, they have them of bulls, but they also have them of ships and all manner of things, including dancing and obeisance to the goddess. So to answer your question, yes, they had a female goddess whom they worshipped, and there are hundreds and hundreds of seals and paintings and engravings and paintings on vases and frescoes on walls showing them paying respect to their female goddess.
Any idea what her name was?
No, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Persephone, I think, was one, but that was given by the Greeks later on.
Well, I know that I've read that in all actuality, goddess worship was around long before monotheism was.
Was it? Yes.
So that would just confirm that particular fact that, you know, monotheism was like a newcomer on the scene that just created a whole new thing.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
I also wanted to ask you about the upcoming book you were talking about, the translation of Linear A.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, we've agreed, Professor Minas Tsakritsis and I have agreed to do a joint book. We're just thrashing out who will write about what and so on. Basically, it's going to be mainly his research. It'll cover all sorts of things: mathematics, astronomy. For instance, mathematics. They had highly advanced mathematics with many things which the Greeks later on said they'd invented, like arithmetic and geometric progression and so on, were actually Minoan. The Minoans, apart from mathematics, they had discovered that the relationship between the radius and circumference of a circle, pi, which they found out was 3.158. So they were pretty close to the real value of pi. They also had worked out the golden mean, which is used by the Greeks and subsequently right through civilization by Leonardo and many other famous architects. And the golden mean, which they found out, phi, was a measurement of 1.618, which is dead right. And as I say, they had arithmetic and geometric progression. So they had mathematics systems which were really not rediscovered until the Greeks. And their knowledge of the heavens, they'd worked out that the sun was at the center of our system, solar system, and not the Earth. And they found that the Earth went around the sun in an ellipse. So they foreshadowed Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler. They had a form of Olympic Games. And they had all sorts of musical instruments. So the long-robed priests you can see in various carvings and so on in Crete, that they basically had lyres and various stringed instruments which were played in the ceremonies in which they worshipped their female goddess.
That's very fascinating. No, so little is known. So this book that you're going to be coming out with, is it going to be like a translation of the full entire linear script so that people will know what they wrote themselves?
We haven't really decided yet, but I will when we have. I hope to get to Crete next week. But when we have decided, we've got chapter headings, but we haven't decided precisely who's going to write them and who's going to do what. But I will make sure that I send you, and then perhaps we can have another interview when we know this.
Yeah, I would like to be kept informed on this, because I've often wondered exactly what all was covered in those Linear A scripts, because me and my friend Sherry, we had talked about it at some length trying to speculate, but naturally, from our homes here in America, we don't have a lot of hope of getting very far with it, you know what I mean?
No. Well, the reason I'm sure that Minas Tsakritsis has correctly deciphered Linear A is his description of where the Minoans went. Now, there are 9 places in his email, which he sent me before seeing my book, before hearing in detail of what's in it, before seeing my website. He sent me this email saying where they got to, which is exactly the same as mine. Now, I say 1 or 2 places being the same, it could be a coincidence. 3 or 4, it's pretty unlikely that it's a coincidence. And 9 places, it's virtually impossible. I mean, factorial 9, which is something like 600,000 to 1 against.
Okay. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
so that's why I think he's dead right.
Okay. Now, Open Mind in the chat room wanted me to ask you if they advanced technologically.
Well, they had their ships are really beautifully constructed, and especially their methods of sailing into the wind. It's pretty difficult to describe that unless you look at the pictures in my book, which I hope makes it reasonably clear. So their ships were technological marvels. Their houses were 4 stories. They had hot and cold running water. They had windows, alabaster windows, translucent, which let in the light. They had sewage system with methods of separating out solid sewage and liquid sewage. And they had kitchens and all sorts of, you could go in there and cook today. So technologically, their town planning and their construction, they were first rate. That's really all we can say at the moment, I think, because the archaeologists have really only just scratched the surface of what's there for them to do in Santorini.
So there's going to be a lot more to come in the future still.
Yeah.
Good.
It is.
Okay, well, listen, I was noticing we got 9 minutes left, and I wanted to mention to everybody once again that the show's calling number is 832-632-7904, and you can learn more about Gavin at www.gavinmenzies.net, and also his book is right underneath his description here. It's linked, all 3 of them, over to Amazon, and I'll be moving them off the front page tomorrow or later today and moving them into the archive, but the links to the books will still be there. You can also go to Amazon.com and use their search engine to type in his name, and it'll pull up any books that they have on them that way as well. So there's plenty of ways for y'all to learn more about this if you're interested. I want to thank everybody for coming and taking a part in the show. I want to remind everybody not to forget to check out United Paranormal International. There's some pretty good folks over there. They got a social network with a lot of researchers and investigators, and it's a great place to learn. And also wanted to mention to everybody real quick that my guest this coming Tuesday night at 8 p.m., January 31st, is Laser Les Tinsdale, and he has some rocks that were found here in America that he says was engraved with a certain kind of tool that you have to use a certain kind of light technology to read, that he thinks he's found information from the Anunnaki of the Sumerians. Y'all might want to come by and see what he has to say. He's told me he's done some recent research and had some new findings, and I'll be glad to find out what he's found. Now, Gavin, while we still got you here and present, are there any last-minute thoughts or anything that you'd like to throw out there?
Well, I'd like to thank you you've obviously read my book with great care, and I'd like to thank you very much for that and for inviting me. And I hope I can come back in a few months when we've got the Linear A sorted out and have another interview. Thank you so much, Royce.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Gavin. I really appreciate you being here.
All the best.
Okay, you have a good
night.
Day. Good night. Bye-bye.